Welcome to episode 305 of the Red Dirt Agronomy Podcast. My name is Dave Deacon. Consider this your warning. It's about to get buggy. We're talking about those creepy, crawly corruptors of crops, those bugs that can derail yields, of course, the insects that impact the acreages across our state. We're talking about insect pressures with Oklahoma State University's extension cropping entomologist, Dr. Ashley Faris. By the way, you'll be able to find the information we talk about in this episode and past episodes on our website, reddirtagronomy.com. As always, we'll start with a quick trip around the table for an introduction to the dream team of dirt and everything that grows from it. Let's start with Oklahoma State University Extension Precision Nutrient Management Specialist.
Well, I wasn't ready. I thought you were maintaining that sugarcane aphid line of thought. I don't have a sugarcane aphid related question.
Dr. Brian Arnell. And next to him is Oklahoma State University Extension Cropping System Specialist.
I mean, it's even a lot for me to digest and comprehend, and I mean, it's just what I do.
Dr. Josh Lofton. Before we dive into Dr. Faris's interview, let's get a quick crop update from Dr. Josh Lofton that was recorded on April 25th, 2024. You are listening to the Red Dirt Agronomy Podcast.
So, Josh, where are we with the summer crops?
Is that it? Okay. Great, Dave.
There's a chance.
I mean, we're coming along. It's been a slow spring. We've had really marginal soil temperatures for a long time. Even though it was calendar time to plant, our soil temperatures were very marginal. Corn has been kind of in flux. If you've had the rain, we've got corn. Most of the corn that I've heard of go in has came up pretty good.
Right.
I mean, most everybody has gotten some rain to be able to get it up. Corn looks pretty good. It's because we're still so cool. We're starting to see that yellow flashing with, sulfur, and we talk about it all the time. Is we need time for that to warm up, for the sulfur to break down out of the organic matter, nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, get into the plant, be available. So it's not actually deficient, but we got a lot of very yellow corn, either from freeze events or from just low mineralization of organic matter.
Yeah, Jason Kelly with Arkansas was posting about that this week. So they're seeing this throughout a lot of the southeast. Really is seeing the same yellowing.
Yeah, and it's just been a very cool spring. Even though we've had very warm days, we've had very cold days still yet. So when we get the rain and we get the warm days kind of more consistently, we'll see it kind of typically bounce out of it. Growers want to think about applying. It's fine. It's probably not going to get economical. Brian can kind of comment on that. I doubt economics comes in enough to pay for that application. But if you're really just wanting to sleep better at night,
right,
you can green that corn up right now. But give it a month, it'll probably green up on its own. And we've seen that planting date is really impacting that. When we have earlier planting stuff and went through that yellowing phase, even though we really haven't started mineralizing that nitrogen, that sulfur, the roots are getting down deep enough that it's finding other options for it. So our bigger corn's getting greener, smaller corn's still yellow. So it just takes time. And we've started seeing some of our other summer crops kind of go in. It's soybean time, it's sorghum time. We're kind of actually on the back end of corn time,
right,
even though our temperatures don't kind of suggest that. But we are kind of on the back end of that first flush of corn planting. So we are getting to that time that we are getting a little late, long in the tooth for corn. So we probably need to start thinking about switching to sorghum or soybeans if you don't have anything or
right,
everything in, or think about moving that corn to later planted corn on in the summer. So we still got time on a lot of things. We're as we're recording this, they're saying statewide moisture this coming weekend.
Right.
They, for some odd reason, don't have a name attached to them, so they can never get blamed for when they aren't correct.
I think they dropped the name after the last disappointment with rain. Yeah.
Yeah. And so, if we get good moisture, we're so early compared to where we've been the last couple of years for moisture. So we got nice temperatures. They're still very mild. We're not in the 90s. We're still decent. And then we're going to pick up cotton here pretty soon.
Right.
Probably within the next couple of weeks, we'll start seeing cotton start flying in the ground. And so then we'll be kind of off to the races until we get, probably planting throughout the spring until we get to wheat harvest.
Yeah.
And then we'll switch that trigger to wheat harvest and then go back to double crop.
One question I have on that is really in Oklahoma and maybe across the Southern Great Plains, there's really two regions for corn and soybeans. There's the eastern part of the state, and then there's also the Panhandle. Are we seeing planting in throughout the same time frame in both locations?
Well, actually, we're really right now we're back into corn, really early soybean and corn or in sorghum for the central part of the state.
Right.
And if we kind of look at it, it's not happening in corn because the Panhandle is so big and still in corn. But whenever you look at like counties like Kay County, Grant County, Garfield County, those have really taken over as our predominant soybean growing counties. And so right now is that time. Eastern is just very consistent.
Yeah.
And we are probably still a little early to be planting soybeans. I know there are some growers that'll throw them in early, but they are typically so wet.
Yeah.
During the first part of May that soybeans don't like to stand in water a lot. And so if we get towards that second and third week of May, we usually start seeing dry spells kind of come in, which for planting of soybeans is okay as long as we have good soil moisture. So we typically will see them the middle of May to the end of May be planting soybean in the eastern side of the state. And then the Panhandle really will pick up corn at that point in time.
Okay.
And then into June, or, they'll end of May, they'll do the corn and the cotton. And then into June, they'll pick up sorghum. And if they want to throw in soybeans or sunflowers or something along those lines, then we'll pick up that.
We'll actually start dropping in the Panhandle the first or second week of May. I've been going out there around the 7th to the 10th.
Yeah,
doing some early corn and early cotton. We got to pay attention to the temperatures out there and make sure we don't have any 10-day forecast of significant weather events. But there's been a push. So there was once a push to go really early with corn, and now they're actually falling back on that. So they're getting in their cotton first, and they're putting their corn in later, timing some of those heat events that are coming.
Right.
They were put the early corn, the high plains, shorter growth window. So they're pushing corn earlier, thinking we need more time, but it was just timing into anthesis being at a poor time.
Right.
And so now we're seeing a little bit of movement where they're putting the cotton in first, because cotton really does need heat units and needs days, and moving some of that corn back, though.
I think that's what we're still trying to figure out in the Panhandle is the other thing to kind of think of is, we look at McCall, and we've lost cotton on McCall for 2 years because we planted early, and then the hailstorms come, and cotton doesn't take hail like corn can take hail.
Right.
Corn can take hail really easily. Cotton can't really take hail. So you got to start looking at where your rainy seasons are. That's not a great way to plant it, but since they have this May period where they got to get corn and cotton in. It's kind of like, okay, where do I roll the dice? Maybe I'll throw a little bit of cotton in, and then I'll plant some corn, and then I'll throw a little bit more cotton in. That way, just not everything's in the same danger zone. Because, when you talk about hailstorms out there, they just come, and they're bad.
Yeah.
In the last couple of years, they haven't gotten a whole lot of rain. They've got a whole lot of hail. So it's one of those things that kind of gets hit and miss. And the Panhandle still, with bringing in a cotton several years ago now, we're still trying to figure out that best way to manipulate sorghum, cotton, corn, forages, and your wheat system, and how the rotations look, how your planting dates look, and all that kind of just wiggling around. And you'd see the same thing if we got a big flush of cotton out in eastern Oklahoma. It's like, okay, so how do we have to readjust ourselves to what we normally would do to now integrate a new crop and just have time for everything? So right now overall throughout the state, we're doing okay. There's still that big chunk in northwest Oklahoma that is just super dry, and those folks are just not having a good spring. Outside of that really droughty part, most people are starting to see things go in the ground, and most have seen, at least at some point in time, some rain to get something out of the ground. So
with that, it's been talked about, and it's been proven to a certain amount of success that a soybean in a drier situation that has to really reach for that moisture, in some ways it does kind of help the stability of the plant overall. So drier conditions, you want the plant to survive and you want it to thrive, but having those drier situations at some point in the growing cycle can kind of be beneficial, he says with a question mark.
both of our broadleafs, they can use with a little bit of stress.
Right.
Our cotton and our soybean can use with a little bit of stress.
Right.
I thought it was very interesting. It's really started putting pieces together. Brian Pugh came Winter Crop School a couple of years ago and talked about how restricted layers on soybeans stop root growth, and it really inhibits their ability to survive our summers.
Right.
But then you start asking how much stress for soybean in particular will mitigate or stop that root growth to where we might not ever start it again.
Right.
And so it's okay. So we know acidity layers can do it. We know tillage layers can do it. But can we get too dry that it stops root growth and then we just never start again?
Yeah.
I don't know the answer to that, but it would make sense to why some of our soybean in really dry springs kind of come up and just kind of sit there for a while, and then they're not very hardy when July comes. But I don't know if there's merit to that or not. But you want a little stress. You don't want a lot of stress, though.
Well, and one other thing with that, you and I have had this conversation several times about the fact that soybeans in this area are not necessarily a full season crop. I mean, they're a short season crop in this area of the country because they do get the sunlight, they do get the heat, they do get, everything compacted into a shorter growing season.
Well, I mean, it depends. Our full season, because we are kind of on the southern half of the United States, we do have a very long vegetative period.
Right.
Compared to people like up in the northern Great Plains or the Midwest or something like that has a more abbreviated growing season than even us.
Yeah.
We just function so much on double crop that's where our really restricted seasons come in.
Right.
And the growers that have been managing full season and double crop in their same systems have really kind of adapted their systems to manage. Those are basically two different crops. Those are not the same crop. They can't be treated like the same crop.
Right.
So you have to kind of adjust your management. You have to adjust your expectations and everything that falls into that place when you move from a full season, especially soybean. When you move from a soybean plant that has a very long vegetative period when you plant it in April, and soybeans planted in June have a very short vegetative period. That is not typically as common in like sorghum. When we go from a April planted sorghum to a June planted sorghum, it still has an abbreviated vegetative, but not as abbreviated as soybeans have. So soybean itself going from full to double season is a different crop, and our double crop soybean is just such an integral part of our state because especially this year, our wheat looks great.
Yeah.
And so most of our wheat it looks better than it's been in the last couple of years. So, but at this point in time, in the last couple of years, we had a lot of growers terminating out wheat. I don't know if we'll have that many growers terminate out wheat.
Right.
Because it's a decent price, and even in decent situations, we can get some nice yield and really lean into our double crop systems, which are so important to Oklahoma because it matches our weather. At that point.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, Josh. I'll let you introduce our guest here today, kind of keeping with that the cropping systems approach. So,
well, because I know everybody hates it, but as part of extension, you just have to be called it for your first year or two. So we had the new Tom Royer. Well, I guess I would say our row crop entomologist, but it's just basically our field crop entomologist because you do more than row crops. But we have our brand new all crops entomologist, Ashley Faris, coming to us from Texas A&M. So she's very familiar with the Southern Great Plains and the systems here. Started not too long ago, January, correct?
End of January.
So really just hitting the ground. Wanted to have her on, talk about a little bit about her background, introduce her to all the growers, and know that she's out here willing to do some work and excited to learn the system.
Yeah, so thanks for having me and inviting me 2 days ago. So I will preface it with that.
That is when everybody gets invited.
That's the way extension works, right? So yes,
2 days more than most. So.
Oh, okay, all right. Well, then I feel a little bit better. I did say coming into this, it felt a little bit like qualifying exams. You know, I'm like, ooh, what am I going to be asked? But so I guess a little bit about me. I grew up in Georgetown, Texas, so I am a native Texan. I do start off usually by apologizing when I introduce myself to native Oklahomans for that. But I will also say, being a Texan, there is no place too far in Oklahoma for me to travel. So that is
true.
the other thing to think about.
Yeah.
So it is good to have a Texan in this position. So undergrad, Texas A&M. I followed in my dad's footsteps. Degree in entomology is what I did. My master's, actually forensic science from Sam Houston State University, not too far from College Station in Huntsville. And then I ended up going back to A&M for my Ph.D. in entomology, postdoc at Corpus Christi Research Station. Extension and AgriLife is what I was doing. I was working with the sugarcane aphid project, so the area-wide project. And that's where I really got linked up with some Oklahoma State collaborators and also with the USDA Stillwater group here too, and looked largely at natural enemies in that system for grain sorghum. So.
Yeah, so we worked a lot because you were, correct me if I'm wrong, but you were down with Mike.
Yes, Mike Brewer. Yes.
Down there. Mm-hmm. So Mike Brewer, Texas A&M, was really one of the pioneers or the front runners when we got the sorghum aphid, or previously sugarcane aphid in that area. So, Dave Kearns coming over from Louisiana, meeting with Mike, and then, Tom catching it whenever it came into Oklahoma. It really made good strides to where we don't talk about it very often now, and that's a good thing. When we get a pest come through and it really causes a lot of damage, but then we ended up not talking about it, it means that we have learned some stuff, and hopefully we've learned enough to control, at least to keep it manageable.
Yeah, definitely. So being in Corpus, it was interesting. So I'll say for my PhD, it was still also largely focused on forensic applications. And so people are like, how do you go from that to field crops? So really a lot of my PhD was focused on looking at insect biology and ecology and the things that are impacting what's driving attraction of certain insects to decomposing remains. And if you think about it, field crops, they're changing over time too. There's environmental conditions that impact them and also cause them to be more attractive, less attractive at different types of stages. And so my postdoc advisor, Mike, took a really big chance on me with me coming there. I also did some work with ecological modeling, looking at some of these different factors of how they're impacting and driving these different attraction rates, errors associated with how long or when these insects are going to arrive. And it's all skill sets that you can apply in a cropping system too. So with the sugarcane aphid, what we saw when I started up with them, it was in 2017. So at that point, we at least had labels on some insecticides, that could be used for control. And also what we were seeing is a really good opportunity to collect a lot of data. And I think that's the really cool thing about these area-wide projects. You get information from, Mexico up through to Kansas, over to Georgia, down into Florida. And so we've got a lot of information about these insect patterns, the weather that was going on with these events as well, how the pests spread, and then also how those natural enemies came in. So I did some experiments in Corpus that were mirrored here in Stillwater too. And we looked at how natural enemies were playing a role in part of that control. And what we saw in Corpus was it was largely driven by these parasitoids. And then really here in Stillwater, in Oklahoma in general, it was being driven by predators. So lady beetles is what we're looking at, and then also parasitoids too. So.
Okay.
Sorry. I like to talk, though. It's a lot of information, too. So go where you want with that, I guess.
Go where you want.
It's your turn, Brian.
Oh, it's my turn.
Yeah.
Remember, it's a general, so we go back and forth.
I wasn't ready. I thought you were maintaining that sugarcane aphid line of thought. I don't have a sugarcane aphid related question, so do you want to maintain that, or do you want to go elsewhere?
Well, let's go.
Okay. So Ashley...
Turning into Jason Warren over here.
Jason. Child. All right. So, Ashley, as you come into Oklahoma and you're kind of getting your feet on the ground, any insects within the cropping system that are popping out to you that, you have interest in and kind of chasing some of those not necessarily storylines, but advancing your research in that area?
So coming from Texas, I am interested in cotton is what I would say. I haven't worked in soybeans, so I'm eager to do that, and fortunately have made some really nice connections and garnered some support as well from the soybean board. And so what I'd like to do is, in some conversations with Josh too, looking at these stink bugs. And so where are they going, monitoring them, where these populations are building, especially with this double cropping system. That's also something different from the South Texas region that I'm coming from as well. So really primarily looking at monitoring them, seeing if also maybe our economic threshold is a little bit too conservative in that area too. And it sounds like it might be, in talking to Josh, some producers and some other individuals. I want to say you shared that with me. I'll give you some credit. But, like just things to think about. And so it sounds like as of this morning, I found a cooperator that's willing to let me kind of traipse around their fields, do some monitoring this season. And then also, going out to different research stations and seeing what I can monitor there.
Yeah, soybean wise, the stink bug has really come in and at least impacted me. Josh and I spent a lot of time trying to chase that down, and I don't remember it being an issue 10 years ago. I don't remember worrying about spraying for stink bug, but it leveled several of my fields more than a couple years in a row. Not knowing the management of it, not knowing spray time, working with Josh and who would. The timing of the stuff you were recommending, was that in collaboration with some entomologists or just your experimental?
I mean, that's just kind of what we've run over time on kind of seeing where those thresholds are, and it's interesting because I mean I agree with you, because for the longest time when we look at research plots, it's very interesting because. From like weed control standpoint or bug control or we don't really get into the disease as much, but insect control, it's just almost like a calendar application to where, because we need our plots to be completely free of pests if we're not looking at stink bugs. We just go, okay, it's R2, we typically see a big flush, so we're going to go out there and mitigate. Yeah. And so I think there's a good reason why we hadn't before seen, and then we started falling away from that. But, looking at Tom and talking to some of the cooperators, we kind of looked, and I think our big issue that we've talked about on our thresholds is that we don't typically see the numbers that like Arkansas will see. And I think a lot of our thresholds have been adopted from surrounding states. And so when we look at Arkansas's threshold, I mean, they can go from 1 stink bug to 5 stink bugs per 20 sweep in a week. We might never get above 3, but they're here for 3 weeks. And so that's one thing I talked to Ashley about, and Tom before her, is like, how much impact are we having the sub-threshold levels of these pests out on the field? And I think that's what you ran into, is that we're not at thresholds, so we never would make an application. But we are at this situation where we might be seeing an economic loss because they're just staying there for so long at the sub-threshold level, and I don't know. I mean, we have a way to mitigate that for aphids. I mean, and I think working with the sorghum aphid is kind of where I came about. That is, like, we have these aphid days to where we can count. Oh, we have sub-threshold for 3 weeks, so we might look at an application. We've never had that. Tom said we never had that for stink bugs because they can get up and move. So we don't know particularly if they're the same ones. And so, but I'm like, if we sweep Tuesday for 3 straight weeks and we're at 2 to 3 per 20 sweeps, I don't care if it's the same stink bug. I don't care if it's Mr. Jones. It's still there in my beans for 3 weeks. So that's an issue we need to potentially address. But I mean, again, Brian Vincent kind of brought this up, and we have to think about economics as well. From an agronomic basis, I think we easily make that application. But from an economic, I don't know if sub-threshold applications will ever pay off. And I guess that's kind of what you're going to be looking at.
Yeah. So I think building, for me, what I think is really important is participating in a lot of the different outreach or extension related events so I can learn more about what are some of these issues. And I'll say a lot of y'all have been really great about talking with me and sharing them with me, and then getting out there and talking to the producers, seeing what these systems actually look like, learning what their management practices are is going to be really important so that I can start looking at values on some of these things, you know, and also what is their willingness to adopt some of these measures as well.
So one question, if we kind of change a little bit, is one question we've worked a lot with growers with is, you know, there's a lot of growers growing a lot of crops, and they're maybe new to summer crops. So bringing in summer crops and all that, they're kind of learning those systems. There's so many pests that come into a lot of these summer crops, but they're not going to be consistent. And so it's like, okay, so in your corn this year, you want to really worry about cutworms and, you know, et cetera, et cetera. And soybeans this year, we're worrying about stink bugs, but next year we're worrying about podworms. And so how would you go about talking to a grower about managing these pests that aren't necessarily annual pests in a state that just, I mean, we're not Texas, we're not Arkansas, we're not the Midwest, where we're constantly worried about a handful of pests that are almost always there. We might get a pest once every 5 years, and it's really hard for growers to keep track of all these 20 plus pests that are only here once every 5 years or so.
So I think there's two ways to look at this. Part of that falls on myself and other specialists of, are we staying on top of those things? Are we going out and monitoring and aware of what's potentially also coming in from different areas, because Oklahoma also shares, you know, borders with so many other ag heavy states. And then I think the other part of that too is, though, really getting across the importance of vigilance of being and monitoring in their own fields. What are they seeing? And then having that communication also with those of us that can help too. So it's kind of like, I need to be ready for that education on, what are you looking for? What are you potentially seeing? Here are the options that you have for management. Here's the appropriate time to pull the trigger on that management strategy too. And then also, you know, finding out what are those things, so I can prepare that kind of programming for them.
Yeah, because I think entomology is really, it's fun from a research perspective, but then it makes it challenging from a management perspective when you say, okay, the same pest, vegetative, your threshold's like 40. Stupid amount. But by the way, in that one field that now has a flower on it, it is now 2.
Yeah.
So that's a lot to I mean, it's even a lot for me to digest and comprehend. And I mean, it's just what I do. So, I mean, I don't have to worry about the marketing, the economics, all the other stuff that the growers have to. I just worry about production, and keeping track of all those things is just always so challenging. Definitely.
And I will say, I know I'm learning a lot, also about, you know, for these intricacies too, because they didn't exist in the system that I was in before. And so it does get me thinking about, what are some tools or like materials that I can also give that's going to be useful, they can draw upon and will actually still refer to. But I also think about all the exciting opportunities that come with this, whether it be from a research perspective or also from that from getting to work with cooperators. So for me, I think of, I'm not going to be bored in this position. There's no, if I am, then I'm not doing something right, is what I like to think about.
I feel like growers look to weed scientists and entomologists when they say exciting potential as the same negative. That's not as exciting to them.
I know. Sorry.
Oh crap!
Yes, yeah. No, I mean we can meet on that. I totally understand. And you know what? In my mind, when they're telling me about a problem, I'm probably also thinking, oh crap, as well. You know, this is a new one to tackle. Yeah. So I will say I had an interesting experience earlier this week being at some of the wheat tours. Someone came up to me and said, "I know it's not an insect." Very first thing someone says to me. And I'm like, okay. They're like, but we've got kangaroo rats. And I'm like, oh, all right. You know, and so for me, I'm interested in that, especially in my IPM coordinator role too, of like, okay, what are some other issues that are also happening? So even though I'm an entomologist, I'm still also that IPM coordinator. It's supposed to bring these different crews together to be aware of what within a limited budget could we potentially, go ahead and coordinate some research on in the future, or programming on in the future too, especially with some of these grants.
Well, it's funny you say that, because I was talking with C. Brown over at University of Tennessee last week, and he said, yeah, I am an entomologist. I deal with insects, but I'm also the everything else drawer. And oh, wait, so there's this issue. Send it to the entomologist. He's dealing with slugs and in I think corn or soybean. It's in a no-till field.
Yes.
The answer to that is
The
yes.
answer is
Yes.
Right.
To all of
Slugs,
that.
snails.
So-
Yeah, and I said, slugs. Don't you just drive over it and spread salt? And he said, well, it's a little more intricate than that because they go, in the row and they will eat the individual seeds and just, a buffet down the line. And I said, yeah, you really, as an entomologist, you do kind of get everything else.
Definitely. And so actually, Sieb and I were together for undergrad. So I know
okay.
Sieb.
Yeah.
Sieb is someone I keep in my everything drawer just in general that I've bothered him several times already being in this position to be a sounding board on some things.
Right.
And actually he, for that slug project, so he was talking about that at our Entomological Society of America conference this last November, and I ran into him and I was like, what are you doing with slugs? And he said, oh, just wait, is what he told me basically.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Okay.
So,
I think we have a winter crop school guest because we need to talk slugs and snails.
Well,
There you go.
yeah, so he may be someone that maybe we could draw in for that. Josh has a connection to Sieb also, but for that, Sieb actually is someone I pulled in on. Thinking about these importance of these relationships with cooperators and these shocking, surprising things that sometimes we come across. One of my colleagues at UF, he's in an extension and research position in the Florida Panhandle. We are putting together a symposium on looking at these on-farm research opportunities with cooperators.
Yeah.
How do you foster those relationships? How those relationships are important to sustain, not only for the benefit of us and our stakeholders with extension, but also industry. So we're kind of pulling together these different individuals to come and talk in this symposium. We've got about half the spots full. So Sieb is one of those spots. Thank you, Sieb.
Yeah.
But yeah, so we'll see what happens with that. But I will say the experience that I also kind of going back to some of the sugarcane aphid stuff, a lot of that information we gathered were because of relationships we had with cooperators, letting us be on their properties. I mean, it was definitely an issue for them, but how we could develop that data. And so really, if we can use that kind of area-wide model, collect this data of when these weird things happen, maybe we could start tracking when some of these weird off-the-wall occurrences are happening. So maybe we are better informed in the future when they occur too.
Well, and staying with the sugarcane aphid, that was a 2 to 3, maybe 4 season turnaround on that. I mean, from the first time that we were seeing the issues in the sorghum, that it was like, okay, all hands on deck, let's get this taken care of.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. So I know that for me, I think about the natural enemy side of things, but like I said, the researchers in Georgia were really leading, and I want to say also LSU, a lot of the work on the insecticide application for that too. And so, it really was all of these different, and we also at that time had host plant resistance that was coming in, which was really key and important. And fortunately too, if we think about some of the other, if we're thinking about conservation, biological control, those semi-resistant varieties at least weren't also having an impact negatively on those natural enemies. So it was really kind of a perfect storm of all these different tactics coming in together that could help us manage it, and I think get to the level where not so much a concern right now.
One thing I'm really enjoying you saying is the natural enemies, really focusing on those. As opposed to, well, let's just go spray it. There is the financial side of that, but then there's also the, I'll never forget going out on a video shoot with Tom Royer, and he said, "Hey, look at that wasp." I said, "Yeah, that's a wasp." And he said, "That wasp, I forget what insect it was a natural predator of, but that insect or that wasp was killing that insect, and if we just let it do its business, it will take care of it naturally." And in my mind, that was kind of a opposite approach of what I had pictured, pest control being. Let's just drive across the field and spray everything. No, let's let nature take the first stab at it.
Yeah. So I work closely with we'll call them a large cooperator in South Texas, where we were able to go out and monitor their fields with them. And yeah, that was the thing. We'd have communications 4 or 5 o'clock in the morning of, we're going to go spray today. And I'd go back and look at the data from earlier in the week. And it's like, you know what, based on what we're seeing for some of these different populations of the aphid, and then also what we're seeing for natural enemies, if you could hold off on a couple more days, like just wait, and then they'd be like, oh yeah, that actually saved us time and money on that application. Yeah. But we also know it's really hard to get that across to a grower when you're seeing that issue in the field, being like, oh yeah, just wait for this insect, this other insect that's here to do some of its magic.
Right.
And we also had to think about the interesting thing, and it kind of goes to some work that Tom Royer, Chris Giles, and also Norm Elliott with USDA are doing. They have this Glance and Go app for, I want to say green bug or sugarcane aphid and green bug is what they're looking at. Yeah. So they're trying to develop this sugarcane aphid or sorghum aphid, one now is what it's called. And they're wanting to take into account from the area-wide data that we have, the natural enemies in there. So that can be a consideration as a control measure, but you've got to consider generation time turnover for these different natural enemies.
Right.
You also have to consider what that wasp is actually doing versus what a lady beetle is doing. So how much can they consume, how quickly? And in bug nerd world, I'd say there's people that are very much parasitoids or only lady beetles, and there's arguments about that anytime I talk about the data. So those are some things you have to think about: is how voracious is that lady beetle compared to that wasp that's going around and stinging individual aphids.
Yeah.
So, but yeah, they can do some pretty cool things.
All right, I'm going to go sideways because we haven't gone. The bane of my existence in
Oh, no.
small plot research. Josh, do you know what it is, insect-wise?
Oh, insect-wise?
Yeah.
Spin the insect
the
wheel.
bane of my existence is harvester ants.
Oh, God,
Oh.
yes.
Oh, yeah.
It's bad.
I'm all no-till on all my
surprised.
stuff.
Okay.
And so those little boogers can come in and basically wreck 90% of a plot in no time. We spend, I would say every year, my crew spends an upwards of 20 to 30 man hours treating mounds, trying to move. They'll move down, they'll move back, and it is I can get you an aerial image from anywhere in Oklahoma in no-till, and these mounds are evidence size, a 6x6, a 10x10 mound is not uncommon, and they get to at least 2 or 3 foot wide in our research block in no time at all, and they just devoid all
That's
plant
interesting.
residue, and then the
Sorry,
follow-up.
my brain is going, very, very cool, and you're like, oh crap. So.
No, and the worst thing is that okay, so I kill them, right? And so you do get rid of a mound, or at least move it. I don't necessarily think it killed, but we at least move the mound. And then for the next year, I have this massive green spot that is unlike anything else in small plots. So I can't put a trial there for 1 to 3 years because of the way they have disturbed and changed the nutrient balance and physical properties of that soil is evident for 2 or 3 years later.
That's really interesting. I've not seen those in action. I'm familiar with like leafcutter ants, and so I've watched what I think is a very cool trail, although my husband's aunt doesn't find it very cool when they've like stripped all the crepe myrtles of their leaves and everything.
Yeah.
But no, that is really interesting. And I will say, me coming from A&M, entomology department is standalone.
Yeah.
And which I think sometimes has its strengths, but really what I'm enjoying about being here at Oklahoma State is it being with plant pathology and how closely this department really works with plant and soil sciences and other departments too. So isolated in my own little world, I don't think about impact of that, then changing that dynamic of the system. So I kind of want to see this.
And farmers, and I
see
usually get lots of calls from farmers about treatment. There's one chemical option, but it, like I said, they move back, and so they could go across the fence line, then make their way right back if the tree. But you can go to a lot of our no-till fields, especially wheat no-till. And it's evident from aerial imagery of just the impact. And that's one thing I'd like to do, some imagery, is actually look at. It's not going to be more than 1% or 2 per the field, but it's definitely there. And it's as much as anything ugly. Small plot, it is absolutely destructive.
It's devastating small plot.
Yeah. No, that's really interesting. I'm going to be thinking about some ideas for find a student for school. Find the next sucker.
Find a way to kill them.
Okay.
We've done everything from taking shovels to the mounds to chemical, and the ant bait does not work. There's a chemical or 2 that are optional that are somewhat okay. But they're a nuisance.
They are.
That's interesting.
How about doesn't he work in chinch bug? Because that's my other nuisance.
There's where it was.
I have.
Where I knew it was going to come up at some point in time.
I have not, but Tom had also warned me that should be something that I be on the lookout for too. So for y'all, where do y'all primarily see them then?
Yes.
Okay. All right. They're
Primarily
good to know.
outdoors.
Okay.
Yeah.
in
That's
the
not
field,
true because they are very,
Well, I guess you're
very
right.
common household
household
pests.
pests.
Yes.
So it is not always in the field.
Well, I said primarily. I mean, sometimes they have to make their way in.
Both false and true.
Yeah. A lot of false, but some pockets of true chinch bug that do significantly more damage than the falses do.
Yeah.
But Where they're bad, they're bad.
Okay.
And I found it very interesting this last summer. We had all these chinch bug issues, and Kansas and Texas finally got them, so the world was ending. And
it's so true.
I told Brent Bean, I've told you for 5 years that it was an issue, and nobody listened to me. But Kansas got it now that it's the world is ending. But it's an issue, and I think one of the biggest things, of course, going back to, was this a scouting issue or was this a change in species issue? When we first got them really bad, I think it was about 3 years ago.
Yeah,
and I called Tom and I said, "Can chinch bugs kill a sorghum plant?" He said, "No, we won't. They won't be economical ever." And he had not seen them be at an economic threshold to where treatment overcame the fact. Well, in that year, we had chinch bugs completely destroy fields.
Wow.
Okay.
And it was always thought it was a stock stability issue and it was maybe a stand issue, but it was never a grain yield won't be there issue. That year it was a grain yield will not be there issue.
So,
and it's when the drought came in and the chinch bugs paired with the drought. If that crop is vigorously growing, I don't think we ever have that big of an issue, but it's when the crop is cannot outgrow the chinch bugs like we've had in the last 3 years with the drought.
There's going to be somewhere in Oklahoma where we're impacted by drought.
Yeah.
It's not too hard to say that.
And I think that's why Kansas and Texas kind of finally saw it, because when they saw the dry come in and the chinch bugs moved in that direction, because we were dry then in the wheat and they're coming out of the wheat and now into sorghum, then they saw it, then it became a region-wide issue and not just an Oklahoma issue.
This also probably goes back to kind of like what you're saying in terms of like crop diversity of what's available at different times, where in Texas, I'm not familiar with Kansas, but like in Texas, it may not have been the perfect storm for this to occur, in terms of crops available until there was that drought stress to where they could really take hold. But no, that's
and I think it's also like talking to some of the folks in Kansas, they do have it more often than not, but it's usually late season.
Okay.
And so it is maybe a stock strength issue, or it is in the head issue to where it's easy to manage. In Oklahoma, it's in a whorl issue, it's a leaf color issue. So we're seeing young plants get
and that's going to cause the damage, like that you're not going to get. Yeah, that's
and the
timing of when it hits there.
I mean, even getting into that whirl is just...
Well, and the interesting thing that, I guess I learned, because I'm not an entomologist, and it's the adults, which is what you see, are not causing the issue. It's the nymphs that never come out of the collar.
Oh, yeah, no, yes, so you're not going to see them, yes.
So you never know, and even if you control all the adults, you have all these nymphs that are still down in the collar that are still causing the majority of the damage. And you're never going to control those.
Well, I'm thinking about also, this leads to questions of the biology of, okay, how many generations are they also having per year too? But yeah, the timing of when they're going to hit that particular growth stage, and how many are going to be available to cause that in terms of insects are going to cause that damage. Yeah, there's a lot of complicating factors.
I went out to a grower up in Pawnee just this last year, and he said the chinch bugs are eating me alive. So I'm like, okay. So we go in, we put some strips out, and we test the old sugarcane aphid material. We test like 4 different pyrethroids. I mean, we're throwing the kitchen sink at them. Would have been great if we had Lorspan, but so we're throwing like the kitchen sink at it, and we kill it, right? But we kill everything that was there. But the sorghum continues to go down, and I'm like, why is this happening? And you peel back the collars, and just the red speckles in the collars are just all over the place. And it's just, fine. We killed most of the nymphs that were running, or most of the adults that were running around.
Yeah,
but we didn't kill any of the adolescents or nymphs or whatever they would be considered at that stage. And so it's like, we're not making a lot of headway here.
Yeah. That's definitely not the only insect that's a problem with. If we think about, I know from what I have heard, mites can also really be an issue. And so if we think about when those insects and when army worms or anything in that complex of also whenever they're, active, it's not always going to be the daytime, and you're not usually going to be out scouting for insects at night, or mites at night. So yeah, there's definitely some interesting challenges that gets you to think about what are some of these different things we can do to manage them.
Well, and it goes back to the same thing, because Warren blames me for all of these insects that are being brought into the state.
He's not wrong.
Has several times on this podcast, actually.
He has several times.
Yes.
And so you start wondering, was this always just a scouting issue, or are we seeing that changing? We talk about climate change and we talk about system changing and stuff like that, or like, are we seeing a change in the environments that are making it to where, chinch bugs were always an issue here. Well, now they're a statewide issue. Well, now they're a region-wide issue. It's like, what is happening that's made them to where they were an isolated issue that is just exploding out? And I think we searched for that with the sorghum aphid for a long time, of like, why the switch happened, because it was a season that it went from we've never seen it to it's killing everything. Well,
and it also gets you thinking about, so I know past work here has also looked at different types of sampling schemes that you do, so like if, exploring that is definitely worthwhile. So how you even enter a field, how you even sample in those different patterns there. Also, how many do you sample? How the frequency of sampling as well. Those are all different variables that I think it's easy to say, well, this is how we've always done it. So we're going to follow the typical, we're going to do a W or a V or some sort of pattern like that, but are we hitting the right areas for that too? So.
And even looking right. I mean, it took me a little bit to train my grads and even myself to get down on the ground, because those freaking chinch bugs are under, like, dig into the residue, look for cracks, open up cracks, and get a shovel.
I
found more with a shovel than I did anything else.
Yeah. Well, and I think also of like our search image patterns too as humans, So I think back to there were some ecologists that did the study, which you couldn't do today, but like basically had a secretary.
I like those.
had a secretary. I was gonna say like Hollings, I think maybe is who it was. Either way, I know Mickey Eubanks, my ecology professor, is probably like rolling over right now, being like, "What? You don't remember?" But like looking at little search patterns, like, and placed out these discs on a table essentially for trying to find and see how quickly humans could identify it, and then translate that basically into a formula for looking at like image search patterns for insects too.
Yeah.
And so I think about that as well, where I'm like, okay, example, husband and I were looking for morels on like our property. We're like, oh, maybe we'll find some, because they should definitely be here in like the region we're at. That's what we've got the mycologist telling us, in the department. And we didn't find anything. And we were like, okay, it's got to be us with our search image pattern. So we just need someone to come out and tell us what we're looking for. So I'm thinking about this also, if we're seeing growers or producers that are having these different insects and they're not familiar with them, also showing them, this is what you find and this is what it looks like in the field. Showing pictures all day, that's useful, and to some degree of like, this is what it is, but physically seeing it in that field. So that's where I get back to some of the extension stuff, demonstrations. But it's also got to be the right time of, okay, this insect's got to be here so I can do this demonstration.
And the interesting thing is I did this to training my grad students as well. So I mean, I agree 100%, because when you're teaching your grad students how to do it, you kind of see that. And we have trained them for so long to look for sorghum aphids, because I'm like, okay, go look for sorghum aphids. So I sent them down to Perkins, where we have canola, that says, hey, go look for aphids on the canola. I'm pretty sure they're going to be there. And so they messaged me and they said, there's no aphids. I'm like, there's no aphids? I'm like, I don't believe you. So I was like, I'm heading down there. And I was like, okay, show me how you're looking. They're looking under the leaves. Because that's for sorghum, that's how you look. And I'm like, no, this is heads. Heads. And I was like, the reason why I know they're there is the lady beetles are here. And so I'm not looking for the pests. I'm looking for, going back to the predators, I'm looking for the predators. And if the predators, which are much easier to find, are there, I know the pest is here somewhere. I don't know where it is, but there's no reason why lady beetles are in this canola if there's no aphids. So.
Well, and that's interesting, because I saw this earlier this week, actually, at the wheat tour in Altus and at Walters. And at Altus, Josh Bouchon had no problem reaching down and finding some English grain aphids for me. So not a pest of economic importance here, but ability to transmit, the pathogen for barley, wheat, dwarf.
Right.
BYD. Yeah, thank you. That's why I always go for the acronym. But,
Yeah.
but yes, and so whenever I went to Altus that same day, then there are lady beetle pupae all over the place. And then yesterday, Maxwell Smith, our cotton IPM specialist there in Altus, sent us a picture, and it was just all of the adult lady beetles that are out. And so when I was there, I was going through looking for these aphids. But yes, they had to be there, or some pest had to be there in order for all of those lady beetles to be there. And Mike Schultz, the superintendent there, said that he's like, I have not seen this, like anything like this before, So it was impressive enough for him to snap the picture and then have them send it on to me. So yeah.
They're probably just confused they have something growing at this time of year. That's really what he's confused about.
That's what he was actually meaning.
And it's not irrigated.
No.
So that's the thing. Well, thanks for coming on with us and talking with us. The last question I have is, do you still get to drive the insect interceptor that Tom used to drive, the old police car that he would drive across the state?
So I'm not going to tattle on anyone, but okay. So it is in my vehicle pool,
Nice.
and I have not driven it. But someone told me that another someone possibly bent the frame on that vehicle.
Oh, no.
Oh, wow.
So I haven't driven it yet. So when I do, it's going to be interesting. But apparently, got a little overeager in their sugarcane aphid hunt. And was looking at the GPS and not at where the vehicle was going. So we'll find out how that drives. I don't know.
Bent the frame on a retired police car. Wow.
I was gonna say yeah. And somebody else caused a little bit of damage to another one of my vehicles. I won't name that person either. So yay. Also yay for cut budgets. I mean, it's not like you can buy a vehicle anyways, like with a grant. So
right. Wow, that's good to know. So
so it exists, is what I will say.
Don't expect the Bugmobile to be rolling down your local highway.
Right? Yeah.
At least not in a straight line.
It's going to go at an angle.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for going on with us and updating us on everything that you're doing. Welcome, and we're glad to have you here in Oklahoma, and I know that the growers are glad to have you too.
Thanks. Yeah, thanks for having me. Glad to be here. So looking forward to maybe coming back with some data in the future when I've got that too.
Thank you for listening in on this conversation of the Red Dirt Agronomy Podcast. If you'd like to join in on the next discussion, send us an email, podcast@reddirtagronomy.com, or send us a tweet. Our handle is reddirtag. We would like to thank Oklahoma State University's crop entomologist, Dr. Ashley Faris, for joining us on this episode of the podcast. And if you get a chance, head over to our website where you can find out more information about our guests, along with many of the resources that they talk about today and on previous episodes as well. Visit reddirtagronomy.com. For Dr. Josh Lofton and Dr. Brian Ernell, I am Dave Deacon, and we all want to thank you for listening. The previous is a copyrighted recording of Ag Now Media LLC 2024. And yes, all rights are reserved.